blood stained the ancient parchment of the marriage decree. 18-year-old Abigail Whitmore stared at her absolute ruin, orchestrated by the very elders she trusted blindly. Bound to a dying Alpha King to save her starving pack, she quickly unearthed a sinister, fatal betrayal lurking beneath her royal wedding veil. Winter had arrived early in the Silverpine territory, bringing with it a biting frost that froze the rivers and a famine that threatened to wipe out the Whitmore pack entirely. Abigail Whitmore, who had just celebrated her 18th naming day, stood by the hearth in her family's modest stone estate. She was not royalty, merely the daughter of a minor regional commander, but she carried the ancient, untainted bloodline of the first Lycans, a trait that had kept her sheltered, yet closely watched by the local governing body. The summons came just after midnight. 2 heavily armed guards, wearing the silver stag crest of the council, pounded on the heavy oak doors of the Whitmore Manor. Abigail was escorted through the freezing snow to the Grand Hall, a towering medieval structure where the Council of Elders convened. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of wood smoke, old wolf pelts, and palpable fear. At the head of the heavy ironwood table sat Lord Reginald Sterling, a man whose wealth in the human realm was matched only by his ruthless political maneuvering within the pack. Beside him sat Arthur Pendleton and Martha Higgins, elders who had known Abigail since she was a pup, playing in the dirt. "Abigail," Lord Sterling began, his voice devoid of any paternal warmth. He did not ask her to sit. "Silverpine is dying. Our grain stores are empty, our hunting grounds are barren, and the feral rogue packs from the northern ridges are massing at our borders. We have precisely 3 weeks before we are overrun, slaughtered, and erased from history." Abigail swallowed hard, keeping her chin raised. "I have trained with the militia, Lord Sterling. I will fight on the borders with the rest of our warriors." Martha Higgins let out a dry, rattling cough that sounded entirely too much like a laugh. "You will not fight, child. You are going to save us, but not with a sword." Lord Sterling slid a heavy roll of parchment across the table. It was sealed with a massive dollop of black wax, stamped with the crest of a roaring wolf, clutching a shattered crown, the sigil of the Iron Fang clan. The Supreme Royal Pack. "King Alaric of the Iron Fang is dying," Sterling announced bluntly, the word sending a shockwave through the room. King Alaric was a legend, a brute of a warrior who had united the Western Territories through sheer force and tactical brilliance. To hear he was dying was akin to hearing the sun was falling from the sky. "He has been struck by the silver rot, a cursed blight that decays the wolf from the inside out. He has no heir, and his kingdom is fracturing." Abigail's heart pounded against her ribs. What does the king's ailment have to do with Silverpine? "He requires a mate," Arthur Pendleton interjected, leaning forward into the candlelight. "A mate of pure, ancient lineage. The royal seers believe that binding his soul to a pure-blood female will stabilize his wolf spirit long enough for him to sire an heir, or at the very least, legitimize his chosen successor before he breathes his last. The council has offered you, Abigail," Sterling said, steepling his fingers. "In exchange for your hand, King Alaric's generals have agreed to send 500 armed Lycan soldiers and 50 wagons of provisions to Silverpine. You will marry the dying king. You will secure our survival." Abigail felt the blood drain from her face. She was 18. She had dreams, quiet hopes of a simple life. Her eyes darted to the back of the room, seeking the one person she trusted to intervene. Thomas. Thomas was her childhood sweetheart, a rising lieutenant in the pack's guard. They had shared whispered promises in the spring, vows of a future together, once he earned his captain's rank. He stood in the shadows near the heavy iron doors, his gaze fixed firmly on the stone floor. "Thomas," Abigail's voice cracked. Tell them we are to be mated in the spring." Thomas stepped forward, but he did not look at her. His jaw was tight, his posture rigid. "Abigail, this is for the pack. We all must make sacrifices." The betrayal struck her with the force of a physical blow. She stared at him, realizing with a sickening clarity that he already knew. The polished silver badge pinned to Thomas's breastplate caught the firelight. It was the badge of a captain. He hadn't just known, he had been paid off. He had traded her life for his promotion and his own survival. "You sold me," she whispered, the words echoing in the silent hall. Lord Stirling slammed a fist onto the table. "You are not being sold, girl. You are doing your duty. You leave at first light. You will be escorted to Castle Ethelgard. Say your goodbyes, Abigail. Your life as a Whitmore is over." As she was roughly escorted out of the hall, Abigail did not weep. The sting of Thomas's betrayal and the cold cruelty of the elders burned away her fear, replacing it with a quiet, hardening resolve. If she was to be sent to the slaughterhouse to wed a rotting corpse of a king, she would not go as a trembling lamb. The journey to Castle Ethelgard took 4 grueling days through treacherous, snow-choked mountain passes. Abigail rode in a suspended iron carriage guarded by 30 of King Alaric's elite soldiers. They did not speak to her. They treated her not as a future queen, but as precious, fragile cargo. When the towering spires of Ethelgard finally pierced the bruised grey sky, Abigail's breath caught in her throat. The fortress was a terrifying monolith of black stone, perched on the edge of a jagged cliff. It smelled of ozone, pine, and blood. She was given no time to rest. The moment her boots touched the cobblestone courtyard, sharp-eyed handmaidens descended upon her. She was stripped, scrubbed violently in a bath of freezing water infused with pungent herbs, and shoved into a heavy gown of deep crimson velvet. A crown of twisted black iron and dark rubies was pinned into her hair, its weight giving her an instant, throbbing headache. "The king waits in the underchapel," a stern woman named Helga informed her, adjusting the tight bodice of the gown. "Keep your eyes lowered. Do not speak unless commanded." The underchapel was a cavernous subterranean hall lit by thousands of flickering tallow candles. The air was thick with the metallic tang of copper and ancient magic. At the far end of the hall stood the altar, and before it, King Alaric. Abigail had expected a withered, bedridden old man. The reality was far more intimidating. Alaric was a giant of a man, broad-shouldered and imposing, with hair the color of midnight and eyes like shattered ice. But the blight was visible. Dark, blackened veins crept up the side of his neck, disappearing into his jawline. His skin was unnervingly pale, and he leaned heavily on a massive broadsword driven into the stone floor, his breathing ragged and wet. As she approached, his ice-blue eyes locked onto hers. The sheer predatory power radiating from him made Abigail's inner wolf cower, yet she forced herself to meet his gaze. He looked at her not with lust or warmth, but with a profound, weary bitterness. The ceremony was a brutal, archaic affair. The high priest chanted in the old Lycan tongue, a language of guttural growls and sharp syllables. Instead of exchanging rings, the priest handed Alaric a silver dagger. With a trembling but forceful hand, the king sliced his own palm, his blood running thick and surprisingly dark. He then took Abigail's hand, ignoring her involuntary flinch, and mirrored the cut on her palm. He pressed their bleeding hands together. "Bound in blood, bound in soul, bound unto the earth," the priest declared. "You are now king and queen of the Iron Fang." The moment their blood mixed, a searing jolt of electricity shot up Abigail's arm. Alaric gasped, staggering backward, violently coughing. One of his generals rushed forward, handing the king a cloth. When Alaric pulled it away from his mouth, it was stained pitch black. Without a word to his new bride, the king turned and limped out of the chapel, leaving Abigail standing alone at the altar. her hand dripping blood onto the cold stone. Hours later, Abigail was locked inside the king's bedchamber. The room was massive, dominated by a 4-poster bed and a roaring fireplace, but it felt like a prison cell. The heavy wooden door was bolted from the outside. She paced the floor, her heart racing. What was expected of her now? The door unlatched with a heavy clank. King Alaric entered, shedding his heavy fur cloak. He looked worse than he had in the chapel. The dark veins seemed to be pulsing. Abigail braced herself, backing away toward the wall. "My king." Alaric let out a dark, breathless chuckle, bracing himself against a heavy oak table. "Save your pleasantries, little wolf. We both know you don't want to be here." "I am here to do my duty," she replied, keeping her voice steady. "To stabilize your spirit." Alaric stopped, his eyes narrowing. He looked at her with a mixture of pity and rage. "Is that what Reginald Sterling told you? That your pure-blood presence would somehow magically cure my rotting soul?" Abigail frowned, a cold dread pooling in her stomach. "Yes, to stabilize your wolf, so you might sire an heir." Alaric reached into his tunic and threw a crumpled piece of parchment onto the table between them. It was the original contract, bearing the signatures of Lord Sterling, Arthur Pendleton, and... Abigail's stomach dropped. "Thomas." "Read the 4th clause," Alaric commanded, his voice a dangerous rumble. Abigail stepped forward with trembling hands and flattened the parchment. Her eyes scanned the elegant, sweeping calligraphy until she found the section. In exchange for the survival of the Silverpine territory, the female Abigail Whitmore is surrendered in full to the Ironfang alchemists. Her lifeblood, carrying the primordial essence, shall be wholly drained and distilled to purge the silver rot from the king's veins. Her sacrifice will seal the alliance. The room spun. She dropped the parchment as if it had burned her. They hadn't sent her here to be a queen. They hadn't sent her here to bear a child. They had sent her here to be slaughtered like livestock. Thomas had signed his name on her death warrant to buy his captaincy. Her pack had traded her blood for grain and soldiers. "A blood transfusion of primordial magic," Alaric said, coughing weakly as he sank into a chair. "The only known cure for the rot. It requires every drop of your blood. You wouldn't survive the process." Tears finally breached Abigail's defenses, spilling down her cheeks, but they were tears of pure, unadulterated fury. She looked at the dying king, the man who held her life in his hands. "So," she whispered, her voice shaking with rage, "call your alchemists, bleed me, save yourself." Alaric stared at her for a long, silent moment. The firelight danced across the black veins on his face. Slowly, he reached out and tossed the contract straight into the blazing hearth. The parchment curled and blackened, turning to ash. "I have killed many in my time, Abigail Whitmore," Alaric said quietly, the Alpha command vibrating in his ruined chest. "But I do not butcher innocent girls to clean up the messes made by cowards. You will not die tonight. But if we are going to survive the vipers in my court and the traitors in yours, we are going to have to play a very dangerous game." For 3 weeks, the royal court of Ethelgard operated under a thick veil of deception. To the lords and ladies who whispered in the vaulted corridors, Queen Abigail was a tragic, temporary fixture, a frightened girl waiting for the alchemists to prepare the extraction ritual that would end her life. To them, King Alaric was a dead man walking, his reign fading with every rattling breath he took. The reality behind the locked doors of the royal bedchamber was vastly different. Alaric had not been struck by a random curse. The silver rot was a synthesized poison, introduced into his wine slowly over several months. He had confided this to Abigail on their second night together, naming his ambitious half-brother, Duke Conrad of House Vane, as the architect of his murder. Conrad controlled the western trading routes and had the wealth to bribe the royal alchemists, led by a wizened, treacherous man named Maester Hemlock. "They intend to bleed you dry on the night of the blood moon," Alaric had explained, his voice rough as he paced the floorboards. "Hemlock will claim the ritual failed, I will die, and Conrad will take the throne, blaming the Silverpine Pack for the faulty magic. Your people will be wiped out as retribution." Abigail had listened, the political machinations snapping into terrifying focus. Her pack's elders had not just sold her. They had unwittingly sold all of Silverpine into a massacre. Thus began their desperate counterplay. Abigail refused to be a victim. Drawing on the ancient, primordial biology humming in her veins, she discovered she could tolerate the toxicity of the silver rot. Every night, away from the prying eyes of Lady Beatrice and the other handmaidens loyal to Conrad, Abigail took the silver dagger from their wedding ceremony. She would make a small, precise incision on her wrist and allow Alaric to drink a few drops of her blood. It was agonizingly intimate. The first time his fangs grazed her skin, she had trembled violently, but the Alpha King was gentle, treating her blood as the sacred, life-saving elixir it was. Her primordial blood acted as an anchor, neutralizing the poison in his system. The blackened veins on his neck slowly began to recede, fading to a pale, bruised yellow. His strength returned, his stride lengthening, the feral, predatory glint igniting once more in his ice-blue eyes. Yet, during the day, they played their parts flawlessly. Alaric leaned heavily on his guards, feigning coughing fits that left him breathless, while Abigail kept her eyes downcast, the picture of a terrified, doomed bride. The charade was pushed to its breaking point when a delegation from Silverpine arrived to finalize the trade agreements and collect their promised soldiers. Abigail sat on the smaller obsidian throne beside Alaric in the great hall, a heavy veil obscuring her face. The heavy oak doors swung open, and the Silverpine envoy marched in. Leading them was Thomas. He wore the gleaming silver armor of a captain, his chest puffed out with arrogant pride. "Your Majesty," Thomas announced, kneeling before the dais. He did not even look at the Queen's throne, assuming Abigail was either locked away in a dungeon or already dead. "I bring the final ledgers from Lord Reginald Sterling. We are prepared to accept the Iron Fang garrison into our borders." Abigail's blood boiled. The sheer audacity of the man, the boy she had once loved, standing there, draped in armor bought with her life. Alaric, slouching in his throne to appear weak, cast a sideways glance at Abigail. He could smell the sudden, sharp spike of her fury. Slowly Alaric raised a hand. "Captain Thomas, your Lord Sterling is quite the negotiator. Tell me, was the price of this alliance a heavy burden on your conscience?" Thomas offered a practiced, mournful expression. "The loss of Abigail Whitmore is a tragedy our pack will mourn for generations, my king. But leaders must make hard choices." Abigail could bear it no longer. She stood up, the velvet of her gown pooling around her boots. With a swift, deliberate motion, she threw back her heavy veil. "You will not have to mourn for generations, Captain," Abigail said, her voice ringing out through the cavernous hall, cold and sharp as cracked ice. Thomas's head snapped up, all the color instantly drained from his face, leaving him a sickening shade of grey. He stumbled backward, his hand instinctively dropping to the hilt of his sword, his eyes wide with unadulterated terror. "Abigail? You're alive?" she finished, stepping down the first tier of the dais. "And wearing a crown. A pity, isn't it? It seems Lord Sterling's grand sacrifice was entirely unnecessary." Whispers erupted among the gathered nobles. Duke Conrad, standing near the pillars, narrowed his dark eyes, his gaze darting between the supposedly dying king and the very much alive queen. The seed of doubt had been planted. The trap was set. Crimson light bled through the stained glass of Castle Ethelgard, casting long, sinister shadows across the vaulted stone corridors. It was the night of the blood moon, an astrological phenomenon that stirred the primal instincts of every Lycan. For Duke Conrad of House Vane, it was the designated hour of his violent ascension. Unsettled by King Alaric's stubborn refusal to die, and infuriated by the new queen's brazen defiance in the Great Hall earlier that week, Conrad realized he could wait no longer. His window of opportunity was closing. He signaled his loyalists. Within minutes, the heavy iron alarm bells of the fortress began to shriek, their frantic clanging vibrating through the thick floorboards. Treason erupted in the lower courtyard. Swords clashed violently against shields as a third of the royal guard turned their blades upon their sworn brothers. Trapped inside the expansive royal bedchamber, Abigail listened to the muffled screams and the metallic ring of steel echoing up the spiral staircases. She knew immediately that the coup was underway. Moving with practiced calm, she secured the heavy iron bolts on the oak door, then scanned the room for a weapon. Her fingers curled tightly around a massive, wrought-iron fire poker resting by the blazing hearth. She did not have to wait long. Heavy, frantic footsteps pounded down the hallway, followed by a thunderous crash against the wood. The iron bolts groaned under the pressure. Another heavy impact shattered the hinges entirely, sending massive splinters flying across the Persian rugs. Stepping through the ruined threshold was not one of Conrad's seasoned assassins, but Thomas. He wore the gleaming silver armor of his newly acquired captaincy, though it was now splattered with the fresh blood of Iron Fang guards. His chest heaved, and his eyes darted around the room with manic desperation. He locked the fractured door behind him as best he could, his broad sword trembling slightly in his grip. "I am sorry, Abigail," Thomas panted, the words tumbling out in a pathetic, breathless rush. "Conrad promised me a lordship in the western provinces once he takes the throne. But if you survive this night, Lord Stirling's betrayal will be exposed to the High Council. My promotion will be revoked, and every elder in Silverpine will hang. You have to die tonight. It's the only way to protect our people, to protect me." Abigail stared at the boy she had once kissed beneath the willow trees of her youth. In the flickering firelight, he was entirely unrecognizable, hollowed out by his own ambition. "You are not protecting our people, Thomas," she said evenly, her voice chillingly calm despite the adrenaline surging through her veins. "You are protecting your own cowardice." She dropped into a low defensive stance, her muscles coiled tightly. "You told the council I wouldn't fight with a sword. You were right." With a guttural, desperate cry, Thomas lunged forward. He swung his heavy broadsword in a lethal, horizontal arc aimed right at her neck. Abigail dropped to her knees, feeling the sharp wind of the blade ruffle her hair as the steel bit deep into the solid wood of the four-poster bed. Before Thomas could yank his weapon free, Abigail pivoted on her heel and drove the heavy iron poker straight into the unarmored back of his knee. Bone crunched loudly in the quiet room. Thomas roared in agony, his left leg instantly buckling beneath him. He crashed to the floor, but blindly backhanded her with his heavy gauntlet as he fell. The thick steel struck her jaw, sending her skidding across the stone floor. She crashed into the base of the heavy oak dining table, her vision exploding into white sparks. The hot metallic taste of copper instantly flooded her mouth. Groaning, Thomas forced himself up on his good leg, ripping his sword from the splintered bedpost. "You always were stubborn," he spat, limping toward her with sheer murder in his eyes. He raised the blade high with both hands, ready to deliver the final downward strike. He never got the chance. A terrifying, earth-shattering snarl ripped through the night air, vibrating the very stone of the fortress walls. The thick glass doors of the balcony exploded inward in a massive shower of glittering shards. King Alaric did not simply enter the room. he erupted into it. He was entirely shifted into his lichen form, a gargantuan, hulking beast of midnight black fur and rippling, corded muscle. The sickening, blackened veins of the silver rot were completely gone, purged by weeks of digesting Abigail's primordial blood. In their place burned an apocalyptic, feral rage. Thomas barely had time to scream. The Alpha King moved with blinding speed, a terrifying blur of shadow and fangs. Alaric's massive jaws clamped down on the traitor's armored shoulder, crushing the steel pauldron as easily as wet parchment. With a brutal, vicious toss of his massive head, Alaric hurled Thomas across the length of the expansive chamber. The captain slammed into the stone hearth with a sickening crack, crumpling to the floor in a broken, unconscious heap. Shifting back to his human form in a fluid, seamless motion, Alaric ignored his own nakedness as he rushed to Abigail's side. He hauled her gently into his arms, his ice-blue eyes scanning her bruising jaw with frantic concern. "Are you hurt, my queen?" "I am fine," she breathed, spitting a mouthful of blood onto the stones. "The courtyard? Conrad?" Alaric let out a dark, chest-deep rumble of a laugh, pressing his forehead firmly against hers. "In iron chains. When I stormed the parapets without a single cough or stumble, his loyalists dropped their weapons in sheer terror. Duke Conrad is currently weeping in the dungeons, and Meister Hemlock is already singing his confessions to the royal inquisitors. The aftermath of the Blood Moon Rebellion was executed with absolute, merciless precision. Duke Conrad and Meister Hemlock were publicly beheaded for high treason before the morning sun reached its zenith, their severed heads mounted on the fortress gates as a warning. Thomas, stripped of his stolen armor and his dignity, was not granted the mercy of a quick death. He was thrown into a rusted cage cart and sent back to Silverpine in heavy iron chains. Alongside him rode a royal decree and 500 elite Iron Fang soldiers. They arrived in Silverpine not as the allies Lord Stirling had purchased, but as a hostile occupying royal force. Following the Queen's strict orders, they distributed the promised food and grain directly to the starving villagers, bypassing the elite completely. Then, they dragged Lord Reginald Stirling and the entire corrupt council out of their manors and back to Ethelgard, to rot in the lightless cells beneath the castle. 1 week later, the brutal winter storms finally broke, revealing a crisp, cloudless sky. Abigail stood on the highest balcony of Castle Ethelgard, looking out over the sprawling, snow-draped valleys of her new kingdom. She wore a tailored gown of midnight blue, the heavy, twisted iron crown of the Iron Fang resting naturally upon her brow. Alaric stepped up quietly behind her, draping a massive, incredibly warm wolf-pelt cloak over her shoulders to ward off the biting mountain wind. He wrapped his strong arms around her waist, pulling her back flush against his broad chest. The political contract, initially forged in deceit and meant to be her death warrant, had evolved into a fierce, unbreakable primordial bond. "They call you the Iron Queen in the merchant wards," Alaric murmured into her hair, kissing her temple. "They whisper that you conquered the fiercest king of the West without shedding a single tear." Abigail leaned back into his warm embrace, her hand resting firmly over his heart, feeling its strong, untainted rhythm beating against her palm. "Let them whisper. We know the truth, Alaric. We conquered the rot together." She had been marched to the slaughterhouse by cowards to save a dying king. Instead, she had butchered the corruption from the inside out, saved her innocent pack from starvation, and claimed the highest throne not as a sacrificial lamb, but as an absolute, undeniable equal. Did Abigail's ruthless revenge and brilliant rise to power satisfy your craving for drama? Betrayal cuts deep, but a true queen always knows how to turn the blade. If you loved this dark werewolf romance and want more intense, twist-filled fantasy stories, hit that like button, share this video with your pack, and subscribe to our channel. Don't forget to ring the bell so you never miss a tale.